From investors to the Olympics, everybody wants security. Today with Breaking Views, we look at G4S. They may be sorry, but their future is far from safe. And first, everyone wanted in. Now it's a fight to get out as investment banks pull out of Asia. With me now to discuss these stories is Reuters Breaking Views' Peter Tal-Larsen. Peter, let's start with G4S. When the chairman says you might have to go, you're pretty much a goner. The CEO looks to be on his way. How does the company get itself out of this hole?
Well, I think, changing the management is the obvious thing to do here, but it doesn't really solve their problem. And the problem is that this Olympic contract, even though in financial terms it's not huge, it's £50 million, which is something that they could actually absorb fairly easily in terms of their revenue. The reputational impact on G4S and its business in the UK is very severe. And so I think you have to assume not only that the £50 million is gone, they won't get it or they'll have to repay it or something, but actually that it will be very difficult for the government to give them any new business in the UK. And if you look at their sort of UK government public policy business,
£1 billion or something.
Yeah, it's
astronomical, isn't it?
It's 10% of their revenue. So you basically can more or less say, well, okay, as things currently stand, reputation is going to be very difficult for them to win any of that. So that's 10% of their business gone. And then you kind of think, well, okay, so what can they do to and then there may be some knock-on effects to other governments who may say, well, look at this disaster in the Olympics in the UK, we don't want to hire you over here either. So it becomes a real problem. Changing the chief executive is one thing, but actually what you really need is you need a complete reputational overhaul. The obvious way to do that would be to have a takeover, would be for some other company to come along and say, well, we've taken it over and we've fixed it. But there really aren't any obvious bidders for G4S. So that really means that if you install a new CEO, they're going to have a long, hard slog to get themselves back up to where they were before this whole thing broke.
I just found this out this morning. I was quite surprised. G4S is the second largest private sector employer in the world.
Yeah, they employ a lot of people. In fact, if they'd succeeded in buying ISS, which they tried to do last year, I believe, they would have been the largest sector employer in the world. So, I mean, there is also
the question: how come they couldn't get 3,500 staff?
Well, yes. I mean, I think there's all kinds of questions. This clearly has not been very well handled, this whole thing. I mean, there's no doubt about that. But it's the knock-on effect that becomes interesting. And of course, it's very difficult. You're not going to say, you're always used to outsourcers, I think, for these Olympic-type contracts. But one of the interesting questions it may raise, actually, is as far as governments are concerned, people saying, well, should we really be outsourcing all this thing to the likes of G4S? You say it's cheaper, but actually it doesn't really work. And maybe you may actually even get a reversal of the whole sort of outsourcing trend of people saying, let's bring some of these people back on the books.
Let's move on to Asia and investment banks. After the crisis erupted 4 or 5 years ago, the investment banking mantra, according to your piece today, was Shanghai, Mumbai, Dubai, or goodbye. Yeah. It seems to be that's flipped to, is it now goodbye, Shanghai, Mumbai, and Dubai?
Yeah, exactly. Well, it hasn't really, the Asian expansion hasn't really panned out as people hoped. I think there was a lot of feeling at the time that the centre of gravity of the world was shifting, and that's where all the growth would be, and therefore that's where the business would be. And it is true that's where the growth is, but the investment banking business hasn't really kept up. And the piece we've written today is particularly about equity trading in Asia, which people thought would be attractive because you had bigger commissions, less competition from these sort of these electronic platforms. And actually, what's happened is that equity trading volumes in Asia are down 22% so far this year, which is actually worse than it is in the US and even worse than in Europe. So that's putting a real squeeze on things. The other thing that's happening is that the other reason to have an equity trading business in Asia is that you can underwrite IPOs, but IPO volumes are also down 30% in Asia, something like that. So people are really feeling the squeeze. And the most fascinating number we've got there is the way Gu's come up with is that they estimate the cost of running a full-service equities platform, so trading, sales, research, IPOs, etc., derivatives, is about $800 million a year in Asia. And there's probably only one or two banks that actually make more revenue than that cost requires. So inevitably, people are reassessing their platforms and basically shrinking. We're seeing marginal players already getting out, and we think that's a trend that will continue.
Well, that begs several questions, but I suppose the obvious one is, where do they go then?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, is there equity trading on the moon? But I think the answer is down, really.
And in terms of geography, America, Europe, developed markets are
Well, yeah, I think. I mean, clearly
attractive.
the dynamics aren't that great on this side of the world either. But I think it just points to the fact that the investment banking business as a whole will get smaller, will employ fewer people, will have less capital in it, and you know, the idea that there's somehow kind of some region is going to come along, save the industry, is I'm afraid mistaken.
We haven't found it yet. Peter,
No.
Thank you very much. Well, that's all for now. My thanks there to Peter Tal Larsen. Well, in these troubled times, one thing you can count on is that Reuters Breaking Views teams will provide insight and analysis on all these top stories. So make sure you watch our US Breaking Views show every day at 12:30 Eastern, 17:30 British Summer Time. I'm Jamie McGeever. This is Reuters.